Hello, my name is Ann Mason. I am the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. This is the third video in our 5-part series on gravestone epitaphs and iconography filmed on Burial Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. In our first two videos, we discussed two popular 18th century motifs, the death's head and the winged cherub. I mentioned that these symbols were often used at the same time. The winged cherub did not replace the death's head overnight. To illustrate this point, I want to show you a row of gravestones from the 1750s that each bear very different symbols. We'll start with this one, the grave of John Watson, who died in 1753. Now at the top of his stone, you'll see a symbol that you haven't yet seen before. There's no death's head, there's no winged cherub or angel there. This is a portrait, and the carver has done a lovely job in providing a representation of John Watson. This is not meant to be drawn from life, not supposed to portray his real appearance, but is supposed to symbolize his status, the type of person that he was. He was a gentleman, he was a prominent Plymouthian. There are a number of portrait stones on Burial Hill, some of men and some of women. If we move to the next stone, this is the gravestone of Elizabeth Watson, who died in 1750, and here we'll see a familiar symbol, the winged cherub, two of them, but above them we see these crossed bones, which are that memento mori, which we talked about earlier, a reminder that death is inevitable. So we have the mix of the two symbols, memento mori, as well as that more hopeful reminder of the soul's flight to heaven. If we continue to the right, we'll see this much smaller slate stone, which is the gravestone of Daniel Watson, who died in 1756. And here we see what we might recognize as a more traditional death's head with that winged skull figure. So as you can tell, all of these stones from the 1750s are carved in very different ways, perhaps out of the choice of the people who are erecting them, or perhaps due to the carver's techniques or skills, or even the economic limitations that a family might have had. It also might tell us something about how tastes change, and perhaps different families in different locations preferred one style over another, even if it might have been changing more rapidly in an urban center like Boston. If we move to the next gravestone, we see a beautifully carved winged cherub or soul effigy, which I know is very hard to see because of the heavy lichen on this stone. This is the grave of Mrs. Elizabeth Clarke, who died September 27th, 1771, when she was just 26. The verse at the bottom reads, "Though the pale corpse is in the grave confined, she leaves a pattern for her sex behind. The sun of virtue never can decay. It shines in time and gives eternal day." Now, up to this point, we've looked at gravestones and the symbols used on them as reminders of death, telling us a little bit about people's beliefs in life and death. But this one is a little bit different because the verse talks about virtue. And instead of reminding the viewer of their death to come, it is hopefully an inspiration for them to live virtuously. Ministers in 18th century New England frequently preached on virtue and frequently talked about women's virtue. They might have described women's virtue, a virtuous woman, as being pious, being willing to submit to God, modest, and diligent in managing her home. And so we can tell from this gravestone a little bit about the ideas about what it meant to be a woman in the 18th century, and some of the prescriptive language about women that it was used at that time does appear in epitaphs on gravestones. If we move to the right again, we'll see another heavily lichened stone, which is for a gentleman this time. This is the stone of George Watson, who died in December of 1800 when he was 83 years old. And at the bottom of his stone, it reads, "No folly wasted his paternal store, no guilt, no sordid avarice made it more. With honest fame and sober plenty crowned, he lived and spread his cheering influence round. Pure was his walk and peaceful was his end. We blessed his reverend length of days, and hailed him in the public ways, with veneration and with praise, our Father and our friend." So this is a rather lengthy verse for a much older gentleman. Elizabeth Clarke died when she was 26. George Watson died when he's in his 80s. And you get a sense from this verse that they are praising his long life and praising his virtues. So there might be womanly virtues that some epitaphs refer to, and here the man's virtues are also praised. The fact that he didn't foolishly waste what his parents had left him. Nor was he greedy, but he was honest, he was sober, and he lived and spread his cheering influence. So he's praised as a father and as a friend. So if you look at gravestones on Burial Hill, you'll often see epitaphs that praise the deceased. And again, these verses can tell us something about cultural values and ideas about virtue for both men and women. Now, if you look at the top of this stone, we have a symbol that we're going to talk about in a later video, the urn and willow. So that's a little sneak peek. But before we leave this side of the hill, I want us to walk up a little ways so we can look at one more stone. This is the stone of Hannah Stevens, daughter of Eleazar and Elizabeth Stevens, who died August 28, 1801, when she was 25. And I wanted to show you this stone, really to compare it with the Elizabeth Clarke stone. Of course, you'll notice that this is beautifully cleaned. So as opposed to poor Elizabeth, we really can't see her soul effigy. But here we can see Hannah's stone very, very clearly. But it's interesting to note, both of these women died in their 20s. Elizabeth when she was 26, and Hannah when she was 25. And yet their stones are about 30 years apart. Their deaths are 30 years apart. So even though we've had that passage of time, Plymouthians are still choosing to use soul effigies or winged cherubs on their gravestones. This one is beautifully done. To look at just the intricate detail, you can see the hairs on the head here. You can see this interesting puff at the neck. So this is much more of what probably if you saw this you would say, well, that's an angel. And then the verse at the bottom of the stone reads, "Her soul was formed on virtue's loveliest mold. No dark dissimulation ever could find an entrance to her breast, nor slander hold a dwelling in her pure, unsullied mind." So again, this verse is praising the deceased, this young woman who died prematurely, and praising her for her virtues, which seems that they're mentioning here is that her mind was pure. She would not hold a slanderous thought. She would not be deceptive in her behavior. That she was honest and good. And so that's the sentiment that we're left with. Again, it's a way of praising the deceased, of memorializing them. It's also a way of inspiring the viewer.